We're going to be talking about private 5G market today. We have a forecast through 2027, so we'll be sharing some insights from that. So this is me, and my email's there. If you feel free to email me if you want. So before we jump into the material, I just want to give an overview of the research that the telecom practice at TBR produces. So this is the list of reports that we publish on an annual basis. Some of these reports are quarterly, some are semi-annual, some are annual. We have benchmarks, market forecasts, market landscape reports, as well as individual vendor and operator reports where we deep dive into specific companies. The three reports that are highlighted in blue are our private cellular networks reports. And those are the reports we're sharing information from on this webinar. So for today's agenda, we're going to talk about which verticals are driving spend on private cellular networks. We're going to be talking about use cases, and we're going to be talking about consultancies and systems integration companies and why they're so important to this market. So let's jump right in. To get a level set, I want to talk about taxonomy and how TBR defines private networks. I have seen many different definitions of this, what's included, what's not included. So we made our own, and we had to do this to build our apples to apples comparisons in our benchmarking and in our market forecasting. So we look at this market through three lenses: public networks, hybrid networks, and private networks. The two green blocks on this chart are what we are talking about on this webinar. This is private networks. So in the hybrid part, there's some gray area on what's public and what's private, especially when there's a CSP involved and they're leveraging some or all of their macro network, their public network assets. So we have a long list of requirements and how we bucketize and categorize what we consider to be public in the public network market size and in the private network market size. So basically what it comes down to is who is buying the infrastructure and who owns it. So for public networks, it's the CSP who is usually buying the infrastructure and owning and operating that infrastructure. There may be managed services involved, but generally speaking, the telecom service provider is buying the infrastructure and owns that infrastructure. On the private network side, it's the same concept, but in this case, it is the non-CSP that owns that infrastructure. And that is a key delineation that we use when we do our market sizing. Now, there is some gray area in there, but generally speaking, that is how we parse this market. And we're going to be showing data for specifically those green blocks there, how we size that portion. So when we look at our market size, we have our base year of 2022 projected out 5 years to 2027. What we see here is 5G and LTE is growing. LTE, the growth rate is slowed quite a bit. It's going to level out and start to trail off in the later years of the forecast, but LTE is still very much in play, and it does have growth runway left. By the way, these are global numbers that we have here. So essentially, when we add LTE and 5G together, the infrastructure opportunity, so this includes RAN, core, transport, and product attached and product near services provided on the private network infrastructure. That's what's included in the market size here. We are projecting an $8 billion total market size in 2027. That's a CAGR of roughly 13% from now until then. So this is a good market growing. This is something that operators are interested in because it's growing. This is also a market area that many vendors are interested in, either through direct sales to enterprise or through channel sales, ultimately to non-CSP customers. This is a growth market for the telecom industry. So what we see is 5G has had a slow start. We're going to talk about some of the reasons for that. We do expect around the middle of this decade, we're going to start to see a big ramp up in 5G private networks. It's going to be contingent on some things happening on the endpoint device side and in addressing complexity and price points. Once those types of things get addressed, I think we're going to see this market really scale. So we have some growth drivers of this. So one thing is deglobalization. This is a trend. What we see is new factories being built in countries that maybe weren't big on manufacturing or that are bringing manufacturing back after outsourcing the majority of those functions. This is very much driven by national security considerations. For example, in the case of semiconductor manufacturing, this is also driven by supply chain resiliency and localizing supply chains. This is very much driven by the COVID debacle, where supply chains took a big hit, and that caused enterprises and businesses of all sizes to do a reassessment of their supply chains and make decisions accordingly to reduce risk. What we see is in these new factories, these new sites that are being built, that is an excellent time to implement digital transformation solutions, of which one of them is private networks. You need advanced connectivity to enable and support many of the digital transformation aspects that businesses are on the journey with. For example, advanced use cases, edge computing, AI, all of these things require connectivity in some way to make it usable in a particular environment, as well as to transmit data and get the insights from that data. The network is critical for supporting that. The second growth driver more broadly is the general trend towards digital transformation. So not just the new factories, the new sites being built, but also brownfield, and how do those environments evolve and become participating in Industry 4.0. Fresh spectrum is being provided to specific markets. We see CBRS in the US market, in Europe, in various countries, there's private spectrum available now. There's also unlicensed bands like 6 gigahertz. You can use Wi-Fi bands, traditional Wi-Fi bands using NRU. If you want to run 5G over an unlicensed band, there's 60 gigahertz that could be used. There's a much broader set of spectrum that is available, or that is soon to become available, where entities can leverage that entities can leverage for private networks. Government stimulus is something that got much more pervasive and significant during the COVID cycle. And there is a lot of money and emphasis now by various governments around the world to invest in strategic technology areas and to invest in the digital transformation of their economies and societies. And there is various pockets of money for this, ranging from broadband investment to R&D. And also indirectly, when factories are being subsidized, there can be situations where private networks can be introduced in those situations. So these are all positive things for the market. Also, China is setting the pace globally for technological innovation. China has become one of the lead countries in the world for driving technology innovation. 5G is one of those areas that they are at the cutting edge in, and that is setting the pace for other countries and regions to try and keep pace with them. So that's also a key driver of growth in this market. There's others, obviously, but these are some of the key things to keep in mind. There's also some areas that are inhibiting the private networks market from scaling faster. And they come down to delays in standards, delays in addressing complexity of the new technology, addressing IT/OT convergence, for example. Those things take time to figure out and evangelize across a company to actually get it built out in a commercialized setting. There's also the limitations on the device ecosystem. LTE has a much more vibrant endpoint device ecosystem than 5G does. And it's going to take some time for that to get addressed. 5G, there's smartphones available today. There's some tablets, some connected PCs. But beyond that, there isn't a whole lot else that's compatible with 5G. And that's a big limitation for this market. The infrastructure might be ready, but do you actually have devices that can use that network? That's a key gap in this market that needs to be addressed. There's skilled resources, having people on staff that understand how to implement IT/OT convergence, how to evolve maybe a factory and to introduce digital transformation into a factory environment. This requires different skill sets, and there is a shortage of those skills in the global market. There is also Wi-Fi is still an incumbent technology pervasively used today. The reality is some use cases for Wi-Fi works just fine. You don't need cellular for every use case. Cellular has use cases that are emphasized towards cellular because they work better with cellular technology. But the reality is that Wi-Fi is still good enough or more than sufficient for many use cases from a private network perspective. We're going to talk about some use cases coming up. The other thing I want to talk about is the health of the industry. There's the rising cost of capital. There's economic recession in some countries. Some companies are pulling back on budgets, things of that nature. That can also delay investments in new areas. Doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means that the timing of those investments might be a little bit further down the road. So all things to keep in mind. Okay, so from a key findings perspective, what we see is that 5G, use cases for 5G, anything having to do with the defense industry or advanced enterprise use cases like AGVs, like mission critical communications, computer vision, those types of use cases, 5G is arguably the best at supporting those types of use cases. And what we see is certain types of companies are emphasized or lean towards 5G. At least that's the case today. Public sector has identified 5G as a strategic technology. It's a technology of national importance. And we see investment across the public sector from an education standpoint, putting 5G in labs, for example, in universities, equipping schools with private 5G networks for coverage, for safety reasons. This is a big area of growth. We also see it from a state and local perspective for smart cities. And we also see it on the federal and national government level from a defense standpoint, disaster recovery, those types of use cases. We see 5G featuring very prominently. What we also see is that network solution providers are partnering with consulting and systems integration firms to drive PCN engagements. When we benchmark vendors and we look at how they're performing in the private cellular networks market, what we typically see is that companies that have a vibrant relationship with C&SI companies that are tightly integrated with them in their channel, in their ecosystem, they tend to outperform. And they outperform companies that are not really as emphasized and oriented towards those types of companies. And the reason for this is the C&SI firms are adept at selling business outcomes, selling the vision of how to take an enterprise customer from point A to point B on their digital transformation journey. And as we said before, 5G is a tool in the toolbox of digital transformation, as is things like edge computing, AI, machine learning. All of these technologies coalesce and they can drive digital transformation, that whole notion of Industry 4.0. And lastly, 5G, what we see, it's needed to drive digital, to enable digital transformation and Industry 4.0. So think about 5G as a platform, an innovation platform, where you're running on that platform a variety of use cases in a particular environment, and the company is able to participate in the value that's created from digital transformation. I want to give you an example of this. In a factory, if you have a 5G platform, you would be supporting conceivably worker safety use cases. Think about smart helmets. You may be running smart screwdrivers that are turning screws on a circuit board that's running over that assembly line. That platform might be running computer vision for surveillance purposes of the campus, for the assembly line, for quality assurance. You may be using AGVs to move parts across the factory floor. All of those use cases are tied to digital transformation. They're manifestations of what digital transformation will look like. And the 5G platform can kind of integrate all of that together, of course, in conjunction with other types of technologies, other business applications that are bringing value from the data and the insights that that data provides. So think about these things coalescing to drive digital transformation. 5G is extremely important for this. Okay, so when we look at verticals and we think about relative opportunity from a market perspective, market size perspective, what we did here is from our Private Cellular Networks market forecast report, we summed up the total forecast opportunity for each of the verticals, and then we ranked them from highest to lowest. And from top to bottom on this chart is the assessment that is our output from that exercise. And what we see is that government is the largest opportunity from a private 5G perspective. This is specifically 5G. If we were looking at LTE, this chart would look different. 5G has changed the paradigm for some industries and some types of entities, and the market opportunities for 5G does look different from other types of access mediums. So government is the top market opportunity from a global perspective. Manufacturing is the second largest opportunity. And then we go transportation, logistics, and then down the list across the remainder of the major verticals. This is obviously not a comprehensive list of verticals, but these are the ones that we typically see private 5G networks either being commercially deployed or being actively tested in today. Okay, so key takeaways here: mission critical and latency sensitive use cases tend to be the best candidates for 5G. Usually these types of use cases, there's an orientation towards 5G. Now, there's other reasons why you would use 5G as well, but I'm talking in generalities here. And this is how we think about it. I want to talk about some use cases. And the way I did it is I grouped these into categories. So the first one is communication. So this is bringing coverage in building, which you could use any access medium for. It doesn't need to be 5G. But when we think about mission critical communications, when we think about public safety, disaster recovery, these are use cases where you're probably going to want to use 5G just because it is the most superior option. Asset insights. This is not new. We've been tracking assets for well over a decade with M2M, with 2G. But what is different is the enhancements in the types of data you can capture, the frequency of the data that you can capture, and the outcomes from that data that is being captured. 5G can give a much richer data flow in terms of what's going on at the sensor level. And this is important for when we think about how predictive and remote diagnostics may embed itself in machinery, in medical devices, things of that nature. Think about supply chain management, how you could track products or parts through the entirety of the supply chain using hybrid networks that straddle public and private networks. These are things where 5G can shine brightly for supporting. AR and VR. This is going to be huge. I do believe that the headset that Apple's coming out with is going to be a game changer. There's a lot of debate in the industry right now about, do people really need that device? Is there a use case for it that is going to make that device a must-have? The initial feedback we've gotten about the device from people who have demoed basically the prototypes is that it was overwhelmingly positive feedback of that piece of technology. So I like to think of that as a moment in time where it'll be viewed as a watershed moment. If we look back in history when the smartphone became a big thing after the first iPhone, I think we're going to see a similar event take place where we see an initial device that changes the paradigm for how that device can be interacted with and the productivity that could be gained from a device like that, a platform like that, and how consumers and enterprises may use a device type like that. From a visual intelligence standpoint, this is also known as computer vision. This use case also, this category of use cases really includes things like surveillance. It was used during COVID for social distancing compliance. People had to be at least 6 feet apart from each other. It was used in airports for thermal imaging to see who might have a fever. It's used for crowd management in stadiums and public venues. It's used for quality assurance on assembly lines with product inspection, things of that nature. You basically are using cameras with a high resolution feed, and you're running an analytics overlay to get insights and to improve business outcomes. 5G can enhance that. Retail experience. Think about the evolution of the brick and mortar store, as well as their back office operations. Think about the transformation of the fulfillment center, how AGVs play a role, how inventory management systems might change. Think about a feature in 5G like positioning, where you can get down to a centimeter level pinpoint accuracy of something within a cell radius. That is a game changer. Those types of features that are endemic to the 5G specification could be leveraged to bring significant value and business outcomes to companies such as retailers. We also have cloud robotics automation. So think about remote machine control. Think about crane operations in a port. where instead of having a person high up in that crane, you have a control center where someone is literally with joysticks and other control mechanisms controlling that crane remotely. Similar concept with mining equipment down in deep pit mines or deep in tunnels. Those types of use cases are where 5G shines because the latency is much lower. You get a higher resolution picture with almost no lag, and you get feature-rich data feeds that you can push through the 5G platform. These are all things that where 5G shines. Okay, so with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. And I see there are a bunch of questions here, so just bear with me. I'm going to go down one by one on this list. So the first question is, what is the percentage breakdown of the private cellular networks market by vertical? Okay, so I'm going to go back to this slide. And so from a global standpoint, I'm just going to give very rough numbers. Government is more than 20%. Manufacturing is more than 20%. Transport and logistics, I think, is like 18 to 20%, roughly. And then you have a long tail with the rest. So really, a large portion of the private 5G opportunity is in the government, manufacturing, transport, logistics verticals. And then you have like natural resources. Those types of verticals are more in the, around maybe 10%, maybe a little bit less than 10% of the global market. Just to give you a very rough idea of relative size of these markets. We have, we have a full data set in the market forecast report. For those of you on this call that subscribe to that research, I would point you in that direction to get much closer numbers there. Okay, the next question is the market data available broken out by region or country? So again, coming back to that report I just mentioned, we do break out the data by region, and we give it by a few countries. China, we break it out, and I think we break out Canada and US. And then the rest of the world, it's on a regional basis. Quite a few people on this call have access to the reports I'm talking about. If you are unsure if you have access to the report or if you want access to those reports I'm quoting, feel free to email me or Haley, and we can point you in the right direction. The next question is, should we think of private 5G as almost completely vRAN deployment, or is there a significant fixed wireline element to private 5G? So, I mean, part of the reason a company would use private 5G is so that they don't need fixed line. If you do away with the wires, you get mobility and the flexibility that comes with that. You're basically implementing wireless fiber, essentially. So today, if you go in most manufacturing environments today, use fixed line connected to their capital equipment. What I want to convey is that in greenfield manufacturing environments, the intention, the orientation is, can we build this without wires? That brings a lot of benefits, and that's really where 5G shines. So I would say it's going to be more on the vRAN side. You're going to have radios in an environment, and that is going to bring your coverage layer and form that access layer for the platform. Now, with that said, there is wireline in that solution because you still need backhaul, right? So you have access points maybe in a factory, but those access points need to be connected back to a core, right? And then you need to backhaul that traffic, and then also go into the data center to funnel the data. So those things require some wireline, but it's not on the, it's not to the endpoint. It's more from a backhaul standpoint is where you're going to see that. Or of course you could use microwave. That's also utilized, especially in mining. We see microwave there. Okay, the next question is, which parameters play a role in deciding for a make or buy scenario for private networks? So make or buy. So I might change that a bit to say customization. Who's customizing their own private networks? And I think companies where the network is business critical and where they can drive definable ROI from that network, where it's that important to the lifeblood of the company, I think you're going to see more emphasis on customization and on controlling more of the value chain for that solution, versus maybe companies that are using it for use cases that are ancillary to the core business of that entity. In those cases, you might see more of an off-the-shelf or a pre-integrated solution feature more prominently in those types of situations. Again, I'm talking generally. There's obviously caveats to these situations, but generally speaking, that's what we would expect to see. The next question is, which of these frequency bands do you recommend for a private 5G solution for airports, and why? So it really depends. We see, lower band, we see mid band. You could make a case for millimeter wave. I think mid band is the sweet spot. So I'd be looking to that. And when I say mid band, I'm really talking about like 2 to 6 gigahertz, somewhere in there. I think is probably the sweet spot for those types of environments. Gives you a good balance of coverage and capacity from a propagation perspective in the mid-band frequencies. The next question is, what problems may arise when multiple RANs in the same frequency band exist in the same or adjacent geographical area? What measures do you see to avoid these problems? So I think what you're asking is international roaming, cross-country roaming. This is a problem, especially for MNCs, multinational corporations, who have facilities in various countries, and they may need a standardized SLA across those particular, across their sites. A consistent QoS, right? Consistent capabilities. This is a limitation. This is a challenge. Carrier aggregation and unlicensed bands that have some global harmonization to them, I think will help alleviate some of those challenges. There's workarounds to address some of these challenges, and I would point companies to look at what some of those workarounds are. And the OEMs, they are actively working on some of these things, and they can advise and demonstrate how some of those things can be worked around, some of those challenges. The next question is, most organizations have issues with the large CapEx required for private network deployment. Do you see these costs decreasing? So private cellular networks are expensive, relatively expensive compared to Wi-Fi. And that is a consideration. However, if the benefits are clearly visible, I think that the cost differential all of a sudden becomes less of a problem. At the end of the day, the companies want to know, how is this technology going to either help me increase my revenue and or decrease my costs? If a company that is selling into these organizations can clearly demonstrate how their solution is going to help address one or both of those ultimate needs, I think that it's a winning formula. And I think that the price of that becomes less of a consideration, and it becomes more of what's the value, what's the maximum value I can get out of this technology. That's a different discussion, and that's where you see powerful outcomes come into the forefront. So think about transformation of the factory as an example, driving significant increases in productivity. Let's say that there is clear evidence that deploying a private 5G network in a certain type of configuration in a factory has been proven to provide, say, a 10% productivity increase of that facility. That is a clear, measurable business outcome that helps the company achieve their business objectives, right? If that can be demonstrated, you can have a very fruitful conversation and maybe even get a premium price for the solution to help the company to realize those benefits. So that's really the line of thinking that I want to convey here. The next question is, as the market takes off in the middle of the decade, do you see the primary driver of private mobile network solutions being driven through carriers with spectrum or via hyperscalers or SIs direct to enterprise with private spectrum? So it's going to be all of the above. The reality is that operators don't have a monopoly on spectrum, at least not anymore. There is licensed spectrum. There's unlicensed spectrum in various bands. There's shared spectrum like CBRS. There is a broad range of frequency bands that are available, from very low band, down to the 600 megahertz level, all the way up into the 60 gigahertz level, and everything in between. And there's different ways, depending on the country and the dynamics of that country, of sourcing and being able to tap into that spectrum. And what I would advise is whoever you're working with, if you're a business that's interested in private networks, working with either a consultancy or a systems integrator or even the OEM themselves or a service provider, and getting a good understanding of the different options that are available and the pros and cons of that. So spectrum, there's propagation considerations. Certain types of environments are better oriented towards certain spectrum bands. Those are all things that need to be considered. And that also factors into the cost. If you're using a higher band spectrum and you need to cover a relatively large area, you need more access points, right? So there's a cost lever there. Versus if you use lower band spectrum, you would need fewer access points. So these are all things that need to be taken into consideration. And again, this is where the OEMs, the SIs, the consultancies, all of the above, the service providers, they can help advise and guide as to the options there.